Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed an honor and a privilege to be here. I am going to read a paper to you tonight. I have been, of late, extemporizing possibly too much in public media of different kinds, and it's a wonderful opportunity for me to find such a literate, thoughtful, well-read audience with whom I can share some sustained reasoning, unlike so many constituencies within the university of today. So, with your indulgence, I'm going to read a paper to you, and then we will, I guess, be very happy to have some discussion in the form of questions and answers. The paper is in 4 parts. First, a preface. Second, something on maps and territories. Third, something on Korzybski's contributions to the global village, as I understand them. And fourth, something on the congruence of general semantics and philosophical practice, a subject which has been mentioned here several times tonight, and which perhaps we can together further a little bit more. Without further ado, then, I would like to begin by thanking the Institute for General Semantics for extending this generous and prestigious invitation to deliver the Korzybski Memorial Lecture for the year 2001. In particular, I thank Martha Santer and Jeff Mordkowitz for their hard work in organizing this event and for their hospitality in taking good care of me. I will endeavor to rise to the occasion in terms of honoring the works and memory of Alfred Korzybski, yet I remain awed by your impressive roster of distinguished speakers past, several of whom have been, thanks to time binding, my mentors at a distance. Names that I have conjured by, and as it turns out, persons who have graced this podium, include precisely those names which you've already read. I picked up the same ones: Ashley Montague, Fry Northrop, Buckminster Fuller, Abraham Maslow, Jay Bernowski, Gregory Bateson, George Steiner, and Albert Ellis. There's a remarkable coincidence. Among other luminaries. To be deemed worthy of joining this constellation is truly a privilege. My mother sent flowers for the occasion. She was even impressed. My colleagues at City College, of course, are not at all impressed that I'm here doing this. They are, however, quite impressed by the same roster of names. So one is never important at home, you know. I have long sustained a philosophical interest in human conflict, its putative causes and possible cures. That interest was thrust upon me as a schoolboy in the autumn of 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when my classmates and I suddenly found ourselves in the front lines of a war about which our ignorance was exceeded only by the dearth of relevant discussion in the classroom and formal study in the academy. In certain salient respects, little has changed in the 39 years since. Last month, we New Yorkers suddenly found ourselves once more in the front lines of a war about which we had been woefully ignorant too, save that now public discussion is plentiful, if ineffectual. The Cold War died with a whimper in the collapse of the Soviet Empire, but now a holy war has been declared on us by foes far more implacable. They have little to lose but their lives, and have paradise to gain besides. So a new tidal wave of religious mass psychosis drowns its hapless victims in a blinding sea of self-righteous hatred and venomous intolerance, ordaining an endless train of martyrs to perish in an escalating cycle of kamikaze-esque infernos that spawn nothing but death, destruction, terror, and misery. And I'm pleased to see from Jay Leno a little comedy too, finally. Is this the manhood of humanity? Did we emerge from Plato's cave only to be driven back into the shadows? Have we come so far only to be regressed by the same old formulae, tribalism and hormones, identification and other social lubricants with emery? The abrasive compounds in current circulation wear skyscrapers into rubble and cities into ash. They are also the antitheses of the philosopher's stone. So while Korzybski's contributions to our understanding of human conflict and its resolution are both laudable in themselves and vital to evaluating current events, he might nonetheless be spinning in his grave, lamenting man's perennial, devout, and obstinate commitment to a cornucopia of lunacies. We're lunatics, but otherwise, as Korzybski in more hopeful moments envisaged as a possibility, we should not have so many other persons and things to lament in their wake. I discovered Korzybski during my graduate studies in London. As a Commonwealth scholar at University College, I could not quite manage to overeat, overdress, or overheat my garret. So I made camp in the British Library, where no one ate too well or dressed too fashionably, but where all bibliophilic appetites were admirably sated, and read to my heart's and mind's content for 3 straight years. I learned that I had a decent nose for books, and following scent trails of ideas, charted some new and perforce interesting pathways through the infinite, intertwined, and enfolded maze of human mentation. Korzybski's works were among the most expansive, well-appointed, and memorable avenues of thought that I explored in that labyrinth, and many of his ideas embedded themselves in mine. I had no inkling back then that I would one day become a philosophical practitioner, nor would that phrase have denoted or connoted anything to me at the time. Nor, for that matter, did those who invited me to give this lecture know of my formative experiences with Korzybski, for I had not hitherto disclosed them plainly. Even so, the intersection of general semantics and philosophical practice is now so evident to me that I am surprised I did not volunteer to give this lecture sooner. I might also add that I'm not here going to embark on a course of numerology or gematria, but it is the 50th annual. I have just turned 50 as well, so this is quite a remarkable coincidence, perhaps. The second part, of maps and territories. Let me illustrate how Korzybski has accompanied me all these years since London, and what an agreeable noetic companion he has been. When building the original website of the American Philosophical Practitioners Association, that's apppa.edu, I reflexively embodied a sitemap. When I reached that sector of the sitemap which mapped the sitemap itself, I immediately recognized it as a non-Korzybskian region and exploited the circumstance in the following way. The sitemap entry under sitemap read, quote, "Congratulations, you have discovered one of two non-Korzybskian regions on this site, in which the map coincides exactly with the territory. Unless you click here." I gave them a little link. Anyway, there's no point in showing you this, but you can visualize. That's another topic that we'll come on to tonight. So just hold that thought. Unless you click here. Before explicating the parenthetical link, I must make clear why the aforementioned region is non-Korzybskian. His dictum that a map is not the territory it represents, although used as an unsalutary straw man by Martin Gardner to vent some misdirected spleen, implies three important points: one logical, one figurative, and one semantic. In its most literal interpretation, a map is not the territory is hardly the simple-minded truism that Gardner willfully disparages, any more than, say, Zeno's paradoxes are simple-minded illustrations that motion is impossible. In Zeno's case, we must find out precisely what is faulty in our assumptions in order to dispel the paradoxical notion that Achilles cannot overtake a tortoise, or that an arrow shot from a bow cannot fly. Although our sensory experiences, like Zeno's, apparently refute such preposterous assertions, humanity required 2,000 years to develop mathematical machinery sufficient to expose the precise errors in reasoning that made such assertions paradoxical. Only then did we settle Zeno's hash. In Korzybski's case, we must find out precisely what is faulty in our mentation in order to dispel the careless confusions between maps and territories that abound in mundane consciousness. Logically speaking, the map cannot be the territory, because if it were, it would have to contain itself, which it plainly cannot. That is to say, a map perfectly congruent with its territory would necessarily depict everything the territory contains, including the map itself. Nowhere on any map do we find the map itself, nor could we ever find such a non-Korzybskian map, for a map of the United States located in New York would have to depict itself in New York, and if it were then transported to L.A., it would have to depict itself en route to L.A. If you imagine that we have the technology to do this, think again. For the map that is depicted in the territory is a map that also depicts the territory on which it is depicted, and which also therefore depicts itself in that depiction, and so forth. Thus, we require an infinite regression of maps, which is impossible. Thus, in any literal sense, the map cannot be the territory, and therefore is not QED. But why do people then allow the same confusion to remanifest at the figurative level? Menus are not meals, numerals are not numbers, prices are not worths, appearances are not realities. Symbols and signs in some are not the things for which they stand, yet these entities are confused pervasively and on a daily basis. Of course, it is profitable for manufacturers to advertise their products so as to promulgate and perpetuate this confusion, mainly by misrepresenting status symbols as stature, and so forth. Philosophers of every age have readily seen through this thin ruse, and thicker ones as well. Having one's life mapped out is palpably a different thing than living it. Moreover, it can be argued that personal unhappiness, and worse, often stems from following someone else's roadmap of your life, while fulfillment almost always ensues from leading your own life, as opposed to following someone else's map of it. At the semantic level, words are not the things for which they stand either, or rather hover as diaphanous and chimerical tokens of things. This insight reaches closer to the kernel of Korzybski's humanism, for its corollaries are intended to liberate humanity from the social, theocratic, and political servitude that stems ineluctably from mistaking names for things, from linking names with distorted, albeit emotionally charged, beliefs about things, and ultimately from acting in the name of these distorted linkages. All that is real are the sufferings and other unwanted progeny of such blind unions that ensue from following fictitious maps, i.e. doctrines, of real territories, i.e. existences. Since such maps are themselves montages, hodgepodges, or revisions of yet other maps, it is not only the case that a map is not the territory it represents, but also manifestly the case that a map is not the territory it represents, is not itself a map that is also not the territory it represents. If you need to hear this again, if you invite philosophers to come and speak to you, you're bound to need to hear things again, but this will be published, will it not? So then someone else can puzzle it out. I think it is correct. Except apparently in cyberspace. For where the map of the site maps itself, the map and the territory seem to coincide. Recall the hypertext in that virtual location. Congratulations, you have discovered one of two non-Korzybskian regions on this site, in which the map coincides exactly with the territory, unless you click here. Of course, this is an enticement to activate the link, which causes a page to be loaded which is identical to the previous page, in every respect save one. Where the site map maps itself, the message on this new page reads, "Congratulations, you have discovered one of two," namely the other this time, "of two non-Korzybskian regions on this site, in which the map coincides exactly with the territory." Parenthesis, did you really think we'd let you Korzybskify a non-Korzybskian region? Clicking on this new link naturally reloads the previous page. I leave it to other philosophers to debate whether virtual domains really potentiate de-Korzybskification. Meanwhile, I received so many questions from puzzled visitors to the site who did not in the least understand my little jest that I eventually removed the sitemap altogether. Korzybski no doubt would have appreciated the irony. People readily confuse maps with territories on a daily basis, yet are themselves confused when the two virtually coincide. Now to the more serious portions. Part 3 is Korzybski and globalization. If we excavate Korzybski's phrase lubricant with emery, we unearth the socio-political equivalent of one of civilization's enduring discontents, which systematic philosophers and other thinkers had previously recognized and had endeavored but failed to remedy, whether in metaphysical, teleological, psychological, political, or moral contexts. Korzybski wrote, "In the functioning of our nervous system, a special harmful factor is involved, a lubricant with emery, so to speak, which retards the development of sane human relations and perverts general sanity." From Science and Sanity, of course. The emery is none other than identification. People are not self-governing primarily because they have propensities to relinquish the burdens of thinking for themselves, of doubting their beliefs, and of examining their lives in exchange for identification with received doctrines. This exchange of amorphous and malleable personal identity for formed and rigid identification with a shared system of belief, or more accurately, in exchange for the delusion of a shared system of belief, invariably retards or arrests psychological development and concomitantly restricts or attenuates epistemic growth. The human equivalent of the homily, "You can't teach an old dog new tricks," is surely, "You can't teach an old Bolshevik new dialectics." It follows that the twin progeny of identification are infantilism and ignorance. As Korzybski observed, this transaction becomes circular. I quote from him again, "Our rulers, who rule our symbols, and so rule a symbolic class of life, impose their own infantilism on our institutions, educational methods, and doctrines. Thus, infantilism breeds ignorance, ignorance, identification, identification, infantilism. The consequences of this vicious circle are as plain to us in 2001 as they were to Korzybski in 1933, and no less poignant in the aftermath of the horrific events of the September 11th. As a result, he wrote back then, a conflict is created and maintained between the advance of science affecting conditions of actual life and the orientations of our rulers, which often remain antiquated by centuries or 1,000 or 2,000 years. The present world conditions are in chaos. Psychologically, there exists a state of helplessness, hopelessness, often resulting in the feeling of insecurity, bitterness, etc. And we have lately witnessed psychopathological mass outbursts similar to those of the Dark Ages. Few of us at present realize that, as long as such ignorance of our rulers prevails, no solution of our human problems is possible. 1933. Korzybski's political prescription contains an intriguing and prescient ambiguity. For there appear to be two ways in which the ignorance of our rulers might cease to prevail, thus permitting our problems to be solved in spite of them rather than exacerbated by them. The first lies in breaking the vicious circle by educating them. The second, in shrinking it toward a singularity by allowing them to remain ignorant while diminishing their control over our lives. Since 1933, events have favored the second method, for the following reasons. Murderous dictators proliferated in the 20th century as in no other, abetted politically by rising tides of nationalism, i.e. tribal identification under political or theocratic totems, and economically by concentration of far-flung resources and consignment of powerful technologies to sanguinary ends. An enlightened despot being no despot at all, one could hardly have preempted Hitler by readmitting him to art school. On the contrary, despotism requires ignorance, among other things, to be fully functional and attain its abysmal potential for ill-doing. Korzybski averred that, quote, if a psychiatrical and scientific enquiry were to be made upon our rulers, mankind would be appalled at the disclosures. Within decades of this utterance, and apparently incognizant of it, Bion undertook precisely this research. As his labors unhappily revealed, the unchecked herd almost always and willingly afflicts itself with the worst despot it can find. Bion wrote, in its search for a leader, the group finds a paranoid schizophrenic or malignant hysteric if possible. Failing either of these, a psychopathic personality with delinquent trends will do. Failing a psychopathic personality, it will pick on the verbally facile, high-grade defective. I have at no time experienced a group of more than 5 people that could not provide a good specimen of one of these. This is from Bion's experiences in groups, published by Tavistock in 1961. In unwitting corroboration of and convergence with Korzybski, albeit on a psychoanalytic tack, Bion further observed that in his contact with the complexities of life in a group, the adult resorts, in what may be a massive regression, to mechanisms described by Melanie Klein as typical of the earliest phases of mental life. This independent account of adult infantilism is also empirically corroboratable ad nauseam by anyone who works in a university or any similarly cloistered community. But the phenomenon is not so well grounded in neo-Freudian accounts as it is in general semantics. The belief in a subscription to a system of shared beliefs is the social lubricant of the group. Identification with this delusion is the emery. Ignorance and infantilism are its dual byproducts, which in turn potentiate the next generation of ignorant lambs, led or slaughtered by infantile shepherds. War, revolution, retribution, and regression are inevitable. So much for the unchecked herd. But if and when the herd is checked by humane laws, to which the rulers are themselves subservient, despotism becomes more difficult, if not impossible, and the group selects a different kind of leader, a CEO instead of a psychopath. While ignorance and infantilism may still surface, such vices will be tempered with virtues, and more constructive courses can be charted. While the prejudices of ignorant and infantile politicians are not thereby eliminated, they are at least relegated to diminishing spheres of influence. This is Marshall McLuhan's Global Village and Buckminster Fuller's Spaceship Earth. The village is managed by its Chamber of Commerce, rather than cowed by its shaman or bullied by its chieftain. At the spaceship's helm is a Captain Kirk, not a Long John Silver. Elected political leaders become celebrity CEOs. They are to the global village as the stars are to the film industry. That is to say, they are shameless exhibitionists, among other things, but are constrained by producers, directors, screenwriters, and ultimately consumers themselves to play the roles assigned to them for a greater good, rather than to prey upon the audience as they please for a greater evil. Thus, globalization, in its most salutary aspects, is reenacting the corollary of Korzybski's prescient prescription. Our rulers may always and even necessarily be ignorant, but the politics of ignorance need not prevail in global governance. Hence, Korzybski's thesis holds out hope for a solution to our human problems. Yet, hope held out is not necessarily hope seized. For Korzybski also foresaw that science and technology, if enlisted in the service of the politics of ignorance, would lead to unprecedented destruction. Seeking some good even in this, He supposed that such developments might at least educate humanity about the true nature of its plight. In 1933, he wrote, "The future war will, perhaps, automatically bring these problems to the foreground. It will be an extremely devastating and less picturesque aerial war in which women and children will not be spared." Given the surety of hindsight, it may be difficult for us to appreciate the clarity and prescience of Korzybski's vision. But consider that he wrote these words before the rearmament of Germany, before the Blitz of London and the Battle of Britain, before the fire bombings of Dresden, Hamburg, and Tokyo, before the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, before the Cuban Missile Crisis and the specter of nuclear holocaust, and before strategic bombings, carpet bombings, saturation bombings, and smart bombings became the order of the day, and also before commercial airlines became international terrorism's target of choice. More particularly, it is instructive, if demoralizing, to contrast Korzybski's warning with assessments by his military, scientific, and political contemporaries, who appear impenitently and almost willfully blind by comparison. For example, recall Field Marshal Haig, CIC of the Allied armies in Europe during World War I. At the First Battle of the Somme, he ordered his troops to walk at port arms across no man's land. Tens of thousands were mowed down in a few hours by Maxim machine guns. This military genius later gave out in 1925, "I am all for using airplanes and tanks, but they are only accessories for the man and horse." Lloyd George, pandering to no one's sensibilities, described Haig as utterly stupid. Similarly, during World War II, the French High Command refused to blockade the main roads behind the Maginot Line with felled trees to impede the invasion of panzer tanks, on the grounds that such obstacles would obstruct the advance of the French cavalry. The speculations of Nobel laureates in physics fared no better. In 1923, Millikan said, "There is no likelihood man can ever tap the power of the atom." 10 years later, Lord Rutherford himself commented, "The energy produced by the breaking down of an atom is a very poor kind of thing. Anyone who looks for a source of power in the transformation of the atom is talking moonshine." That the same year that Korzybski produced Science and Sanity. Leading politicians were just as blind. Witness Chamberlain, the goat of Munich, bleating peace in our time after handing Czechoslovakia to Hitler. A few years later, when it became imperative for America to build an atomic bomb, given that the Nazis and the Soviets were undertaking similar labors, the initiation of the Manhattan Project by Roosevelt required not only the desperate persuasion of Szilard and Einstein, but also the intervention of a childhood friend of Roosevelt's, namely Sachs, without whom not even Einstein's warning would have been heeded. So what enabled Korzybski to foresee the likely if devastating future with such clarity, and what prevented his voice from being heard? Apparently one and the same thing, namely his understanding of human misunderstanding, which entails the constant possibility, if not likelihood, that since misunderstanding is the received and self-perpetuating human condition, those who understand it best are bound first and foremost to be misunderstood themselves. Given that scientific discovery and technological innovation must always, by definition, outstrip military incompetence, scientific naivete, political myopia, and moral stagnation alike, what forces must then prevail in global governance if we are to prevent recrudescences of past horrors and occurrences of yet unimaginable ones? What purchase does general semantics have in a volatile world teeming with rapacious beings, whose cultural evolution is precarious and altogether reversible? Surely one of the most vexing and insidious features of this misnamed Homo sapiens is this, that his congenital dis-ease too often predisposes him to prefer that very dis-ease to its cure. While globalization is a force to be reckoned with, its evolution is not always or necessarily utopian. Ruthless exploiters of underdeveloped resources, both natural and human, have the power to recreate and proliferate the worst excesses of the Industrial Revolution in scores of nations around the globe. By contrast, ruthful developers recognize the utilitarian benefits of not recreating unnecessary hells, and toward that end, social value is an oft-repeated buzzword of late, at least in the inner councils of those who govern the world's financial and commercial engines. Although Korzybski would surely have taken as dim a view of multinational corporate culture's imposed logos as he did of theocracy's mind-numbing dogmas and polity's stultifying slogans, he would also have been bound to notice a difference. While any book, whether of wise benedictions or maleficent ravings, might by accident or design become a religious text, To adopt such a text as the foundation of a political edifice is to flirt with every conceivable kind of disaster, and to ensure that social transactions range from lubricants with emery to unadulterated emery hold the lubricants. We have already discussed the failings of political systems themselves. From the viewpoint of general semantics, theocracy dogmatically resists scientific discovery and technological innovation, while bureaucracy merely countenances them reluctantly and mismanages them clumsily. But insofar as such discovery and innovation conduce to overall systemic efficiency and the amelioration of production and delivery of goods and services, business organizations wholeheartedly embrace them. The knowledge economy and the learning organization are not empty phrases. They apply with increasing force in the global village and are hallmarks of individual open-mindedness and social progress. Optimistically, they portend lubricants without emery. By contrast, when did you last encounter an open-minded religion or an enlightened tyranny? Blindness and ignorance are good for mass religions and good for despotic states, but are manifestly bad for global business. But general semantics are very good for lubricating the transactions of the global village, and hopefully the global village will reciprocate. The fourth part is general semantics and philosophical practice. In this final section, I will endeavor to sketch a few of the connections between general semantics and philosophical practice, and illustrate in the process how Korzybski can and should be viewed as a primogenitor of the nascent movement of philosophical practitioners. Before doing this, I must confess to you a sin of omission that consists in having failed to credit Korzybski as fully as he merits as a theoretician of said movement. In my new book, there is an obvious place in which Korzybski should be credited alongside Bertrand Russell and Mortimer Adler among mid-20th century philosophers who called attention to some wrong turns into dead ends that philosophy had taken. While I did mention Korzybski in a footnote in that chapter, I had completed the manuscript well before writing this lecture, and thus deprived myself of recollecting how much of general semantics intersects with philosophical practice. Allow me partially to remedy that defect now, and also to plug my new book. Since we're on the subject, this is the one that's the consumer-oriented, popular one, going into about 20 languages now, and it's really taking me all over the world to promote philosophical practice. It's truly the thin end of the wedge, not just a book. It seems to be the spearhead of a global movement. And, of course, for those who, nobody here judges books by titles or, of course, by covers, so I needn't say this, but I know plenty of people in New York and elsewhere who can benefit from Prozac, not Plato, or Prozac first and Plato later, or, Plato and Prozac in any order you like. So it goes without saying. Philosophical practice is more serious and in the sense that it's intended for the producer of the services as opposed to the consumer. It's more serious, that is to say, in a rigorous intellectual way, and credits the Academy with having made philosophy irrelevant, and credits my colleagues with endeavoring to make it relevant again. So it is in here, in one of the foundational chapters, that the few philosophers in the 20th century who had some sense of where philosophy had gone so dreadfully wrong and were trying to right it are mentioned, and Korzybski is obviously one of those. I will treat first of similarities between general semantics and philosophical practice most broadly construed, then move on to some special cases. In so doing, I quote from the literature of Stephen Lewis, whose website contains cogent synopses of Korzybski's main themes. I hope that's all right with you. I haven't blundered into some political minefield. I mean, one always has to be careful. But he seemed to be all right. General semantics teaches... I'm quoting from his website. Now, general semantics teaches that life issues become clearer and more manageable as we move toward, 1, a better understanding of the background assumptions we bring to a situation, 2, a willingness and an ability to make accurate observations, 3, a willingness to continuously test, examine, evaluate, and change our assumptions and behavior based on our observations. His website also contains no site map, I was pleased to see. It must be on the same track. Now, if one asks, what does philosophical practice seek to accomplish with and for its clients, be they individuals, groups, or organizations, my response is, it seeks to help them make sense of their circumstances and lives by offering them philosophical insights that enhance understanding and by suggesting interpretations that conduce to betterment. I will amplify this in light of Lewis's 3 points. First, such a process almost invariably involves articulating, examining, clarifying, or modifying a client's background assumptions, insofar as these give rise to cognitive or existential dissonances in light of undeniable or discomforting extramental realities. As Epictetus finally said, Men are not disturbed by things, but by the views which they take of things. Since our views of things are grounded in nothing but our background assumptions, these must be exposed and examined whenever things appear disturbing. Second, accurate observations are the mainstay of empirical science and are in some ways the antithesis to accomplish with and for its clients, be they individuals, groups, or organizations. My response is, it seeks to help them make sense of their circumstances and lives by offering them philosophical insights that enhance understanding and by suggesting interpretations that conduce to betterment. I will amplify this in light of Lewis's 3 points. First, such a process almost invariably involves articulating, examining, clarifying, or modifying a client's background assumptions, insofar as these give rise to cognitive or existential dissonances in light of undeniable or discomforting extramental realities. As Epictetus finally said, men are not disturbed by things, but by the views which they take of things. Since our views of things are grounded in nothing but our background assumptions, these must be exposed and examined whenever things appear disturbing. Second, accurate observations are the mainstay of empirical science and are in some ways the antithesis of armchair metaphysics. Yet the two are linked by the preceding phenomenon, in that the accuracy of observations is conditioned partly by the background assumptions, i.e. the metaphysical presuppositions of a regnant paradigm, inherent in experimental design. Even the most sophisticated scientific theories and elegant experiments are value-laden. And if that is true, which it seemingly is, then how much more contaminated by inaccuracies are the rushed judgments, media-driven opinions, and half-baked ideas of the masses. A willingness to make more accurate, that is, less value-laden observations about self and circumstance must emanate from the client initially. But given this, the practitioner can indeed offer tools that sharpen the client's ability to do so. Third, engaging in continuous assessment of assumptions and pertinent modification of behaviors is tantamount to what Socrates called leading the examined life. Philosophy in this sense is anything but a theoretical or hypothetical activity, for its insights and methods are intended from the outset to alleviate personal difficulties and ameliorate human estates. Thus, Lewis's characterization of general semantics and my characterization of philosophical practice appear largely equivalent, or mostly congruent. Alternatively, from the client's perspective, Lewis lists some perennial loci of noetic and affective discomforts addressable by techniques derived from general semantics. I quote again: personal relationships, critical thinking, professional development, child raising, adjustment to change, communication, industrial management, problem solving, decision making, stress management, conflict management. Consistently enough, this menu reads like the table of contents of my self-help book, Plato Not Prozac, in which my colleagues and I apply philosophical insights in the following areas: relationships, familial strife, the workplace, midlife crisis, morality and ethics, finding meaning and purpose, gaining from loss, adapting to change, and practicing philosophy with groups and organizations in similar ways. Overall, aficionados of general semantics and clients of philosophical practice are seeking to resolve or manage convergent sets of issues and are finding congruent approaches. Now, I want to speak particularly about time binding, which is extremely interesting and, of course, perennially fascinating, as it must be if it's true. The notion of time binding, with derivative notions applicable both to quantitative and qualitative life issues, represent one of Korzybski's most enduring contributions. In essence, time binding, as I understand it, is the capacity to experience not only temporal continuity of consciousness, which humans share with other sentient beings, but also consciousness of temporal continuity, which humans possess uniquely. One general consequence of time binding is our accrual of history, couched in oral, written, or visual traditions. Another general consequence is our accrual not only of symbols and tools, which are the building blocks of human culture, but also of meta-symbols and meta-tools, taken together symbolic structures, which are the blueprints for the space binding of culture, which in turn permits cultural invention, production, dissemination, competition, and obsolescence. These things, in sum, constitute human cultural evolution, which is not Darwinian, rather Lamarckian in character, which is governed sui generis by a process I term synthetic selection, the cultural analog of Darwinian natural selection. Perhaps an example is instructive. Chimpanzees routinely utilize rudimentary tools in their procurement of nourishment. They imbibe rainwater that is accumulated in leaves. They extract nuts from shells using stones. They fish termites from nests using twigs they have stripped for that purpose. However, they do not fabricate vessels to catch rainwater, do not collect the stones they use as nutcrackers, and do not retain the termite fishing twigs they have customized. Why not? Precisely because, Korzybski might answer, they lack the capacity to bind time. Their simian temporal continuity of consciousness allows them to locate a leaf, stone, or twig for a purpose to be fulfilled in the immediate continuous present, but no more. It is human consciousness of temporal continuity that allows us to fabricate and set out vessels in anticipation of catching rainwater, to save stones that make good nutcrackers, and to retain sticks that we had fashioned for specialized purposes for future use. This, in sum, is the difference between spontaneous chimpanzee tool use and Neolithic culture. But that is only the first gift bestowed by time binding. The articulation of symbolic structures permits a further cultural evolution. That is, the refinement of the tools themselves, along with the articulation of symbolic structures that preserve both the blueprints for making the tools and the instructions for using them. And that, in fine, is the difference between Neolithic culture and the developed world. But here, synthetic selection capriciously obtrudes and prevents a uniform cultural evolution across the species. For it is the symbolic structures already in place in a given human group, be it a tribe, a city-state, a nation-state, or multinational consortium, that determines the subsequent acceptance, rejection, or restricted usage of evolving symbols and tools themselves. Thus, symbolic structures may be in place that reject new technologies entire, as the Iron Age was once rejected in the Nile Valley, or that accept new technologies entire, as America accepted the automobile, or that restrict the usage of symbols and tools, as states do when they license professionals of various kinds. Thus, while time binding allows for prodigious human progress, the trajectory of cultural evolution is quite susceptible to censorship, idiosyncrasy, caprice, and regress. While biological evolution is not naturally reversible, cultural evolution is synthetically reversible, and that in myriad ways. For example, a given group of humans can be bombed back to the Stone Age, but only temporarily if it retains its metasymbolic structures. Or it can be deconstructed into the Stone Age, e.g. by the political rectitude that prevails in American higher education. Or it can legislate itself back to the Stone Age, a specialty of fanatical theocratical states. As Korzybski knew full well, time binding in its most elevated form allows ordinary persons of a current generation to resume their cultural evolution where geniuses of previous generations left off. Thus, we can perform Mozart's works, solve Einstein's field equations, and reinterpret Korzybski's system of ideas without consulting these primogenitors directly. Unfortunately, the same phenomenon in its most abysmal form can also cause ordinary persons of a current generation to have their cultural evolution arrested or reversed by malevolent or egregious metastructures imposed by despots of a previous generation. The implications of time binding for philosophical practice are both seminal and vital. If one's unhappiness, or other unease, is a function not so much of things than of unfortunate views taken of things, where the taking means protraction by a time binding, then two important observations follow. First, it does not appear worthwhile, or even feasible, to work on unbinding the unfortunate views taken of things by explicating the causal nexus that gave rise to these debilitating views in the first place. That strategy, which is nothing but boilerplate psychotherapy, too often reconfirms for the client nothing but the justification for holding these unfortunate views to begin with. This only salts the wound. Second, it does appear worthwhile and feasible to exploit time binding in the following way. Instead of seeking to unbind an unfortunate view of things, one seeks to offer an alternative and more fortunate view of them, which, if once time-bound through lived experience, can then replace the older view, not by imposition or usurpation, rather by supersession. This begins to heal the wound. Thus, time binding permits experience and interpretation of experience and assimilation of others' interpretations of experience, without which the human being would resemble a complete victim of circumstance, a robot, or a potted plant. With respect to language and logos, Korzybski bequeaths us a deep paradox. Insofar as general semantics constitutes a useful framework for philosophical practice, whether as a generalized approach to problem solving or as a specific tool for the time binding of constructive lived experience, it also confronts us with a formidable problem, namely the role of linguistic function versus that of semantic structure. The paradox, as I see it, is this. Absent exposure to and acquisition of a natural language, a human being's cultural evolution will be arrested at the level of an ape's. The few well-documented cases of feral children chillingly corroborate this premise. Then again, given the socialization, i.e. lubricant, that flows from normal linguistic function, there is no sure way to prevent a pervasive inculcation of abrasive semantic structures, i.e. emery. When the latter evolves to the point of politopathy, and one confronts a deranged collective whose time-bound abrasions are aligned toward the attainment of a malevolently and malignantly dysfunctional end, one would rather be confronting feral children. Human ferality is tragic but containable, whereas politopathy is tragic but uncontainable. Moreover, the prevention of ferality may produce politopathy, in which case the cure is arguably worse than the disease. And so Korzybski's fundamental question pertaining to progress may prove unanswerable, paradoxically in the light of the very answers he gave. His question was, how is it that we humans have advanced so far in science, mathematics, and technology, yet we demonstrate so much confusion, misunderstanding, and violence in our interactions with others and within ourselves? 1933 again. Could be last week. While we have already identified some central facets of an answer, one further insight of general semantics bears mention now. Well in advance of neuroscientific developments that later richly vindicated him, Korzybski wrote that, notwithstanding the capacity of language to evoke strong emotions, the experience of emotion itself occurs on a nonverbal, or as he termed them, silent levels. Thus, while strong and perforce destructive emotional responses to language, which so often precipitate unsalutary social consequences, may have been inculcated formatively and necessarily by verbal mechanisms, they cannot later be eradicated by substituted verbal mechanisms, no matter how constructive. Both emotional extremes, from laughter to anger, work in just this way. Consider the ambiguous headlines. Escaped leopard, believed spotted. Or, girl becomes Methodist after delicate operation. Or, police stoned in Hartford. They evoke laughter not merely because of their ambiguity, but more significantly because each bears a semantic interpretation that clashes with background assumptions in our received symbolic structures, structures which also connect to nonverbal portions of the brain, e.g. those containing memories and mediating emotions. Words trigger visualizations that undergird their meanings, so as we picture these headlines and perceive the ironies of the unintended meanings and the impossibility of the pictures themselves configured against our received cultural background, we must either laugh in relieved dismissal of this pseudo-threat to the received system, which if real would entail massive reconfiguration, or become unhumorously hypercritical in defense of the received system, and just in case we mistake the unintended meanings as intended, which is also why politically correct people have in general no sense of humor whatsoever, but I leave that on one side. The general semantics of the other emotions work in just the same way. Consider the possible sentiments aroused by these words. I'm going to deconstruct a text for you. I rarely embark on such a dangerous mission because I'm an anti-deconstructionist myself. But however, this time I will utilize deconstruction because it serves a worthwhile end. I quote, "For those who respond to their Lord, good. But for those who respond not to him, had they all that the earth containeth and its like beside it, they would surely give it in ransom. These shall have an evil reckoning, and hell shall be their home. A likeness of the paradise which is promised to those that fear God, the rivers flow beneath it, its food and its shades are everlasting. That is the end of those who fear God, but the end of the unbelievers is the fire." My deconstruction now. Among unbelievers, such as myself, these words initially arouse disbelief, as I take their historical context to be the incoherent ravings of a possible madman. Among classical liberals, such as myself, to further deconstruct it, these words arouse dispassionate tolerance, as I take their religious context to be not very much worse than most others. And I accord people the right to worship pretty much as they please, so long as they leave me and mine out of their prayers. But these words also arouse in me an admixture of compassion and repugnance, for they have enslaved hundreds of millions of people, and have consigned them to an ongoing earthly hell, supposedly reserved for infidels like me in the hereafter. Hence my compassion, And they have moreover sanctified the heinous deeds of an army of terrorists who have murdered thousands of victims, all the while believing they were performing the work of a merciful deity, hence my repugnance. Fanatical believers will do anything in their power to sustain the visions of paradise dancing in their heads, just as children will do with visions of sugar plums on Christmas Eve. Against such a specter, what tangible hope can general semantics hold out for the manhood of humanity? At least for those who would be free, visualization offers more hope than words. Thus, Korzybski introduced it as an alternative pathway toward the excision of Emery. And once again, he turns out to be a scientific prophet, for the powers and efficacies of visualization are only beginning to be appreciated in the West. Here are but a few examples of its relevance. In mathematics, symbolic structures and their relations are often more initially depicted rather than deduced by the mind. Seeing the overall shape of a proof is a prelude to generating its inferential content. In the sciences, visualization ubiquitously precedes hypothetico-deduction. For example, Einstein's depiction of the forms of the field equation of general relativity, like so much of his physics, preceded his arrangements and rearrangements of its mathematical ornaments. In strictly determined games like chess and Go, many outstanding players find their best moves by picturing the strengths and weaknesses of possible positions, rather than by articulating, branching, and pruning the associated decision trees. Composers of music often see the structures before they hear the notes, while seasoned performers can practice a piece from the score alone by visualizing themselves playing it. In general, visualizing one's hands while dreaming abets the process of remembering dreams. I learned that from Castaneda's Dubious Adventures with Don Juan, but that part of it is true. If you want to try it, it works. In Tibetan and other yogas, visualizations of detailed mandalas are prerequisites to advanced yogic practices. And even in the allopathic medical treatment of cancer and other serious illnesses, it is empirically efficacious to complement or supplement invasive interventions with visualizations that mobilize the immune system's response. Finally, in philosophical counseling, the visualization of alternative dispositional states is often a client's key to resolving or dissolving a persistent problem. Thank you. Korzybski was clearly onto something. Even so, it is difficult to visualize a world whose majority of inhabitants are willing or able to excise their emotional emery via visualization. And we must remain vigilant too, lest visualization verge into hallucination. Heed this apocryphal tale, not from Arabian Nights, but from the quintessence of Middle Eastern doublethink. A village elder was trying to sleep during the ferocious heat of the day, but his slumbers were disrupted by a throng of children playing under his window. So he deceived them into departing, and by calling to them, "Children, why are you wasting your time playing here when they are giving away free figs in the marketplace?" At that, the children scampered off to claim this gratuitous treat. The elder then resumed his repose, but he found he could not sleep. "Why am I wasting my time lying here," he mused, "when they are giving away free figs in the marketplace?" While Plato deemed noble lies justifiably told by the ruler for the sake of the polity, only Machiavelli condoned lying to the polity for the sake of the ruler. But neither would have comprehended lying to the polity for one's own sake and then succumbing to the lie to one's own detriment. So where is this marketplace in which free figs are dreamed and the dreamer wakes to seek them? I will tell you. And the tale brings us full circle into yet another non-Korzybskian region. The place in which hallucinations are realities and in which lies are believed by the liar is also a place where the map and the territory coincide. But here's the catch. That place is non-existent. It is only a name, like the square circle or the worker's paradise. It stands for nothing but a synonym for impossibility. And here's the moral. Our global village is manifestly a Korzybskian place, in which our maps are only as good as our ability to make them, only as useful as our ability to interpret them, and in which hallucinations do not correspond to realities, and in which lies cannot represent truths. Thus, it behooves us to remain cognizant of Korzybski's outstanding contributions to the welfare of this village. The alternative, which consists in remaining heedless of them, does not make for better maps, but only for worse territories. Thank you very much for your attendance, attentiveness, and indulgence.